It began with a single photograph, a young girl dressed in a faded white gown, her eyes cast downward as though shame itself was stitched into her skin. Beside her stood a man old enough to be her father, because he was. The caption beneath, handwritten in the curling ink of the 1930s, read only, "Our union, blessed by God." Stories like this are not supposed to surface. They belong to whispers in church basements, to rumors half-believed by locals who would rather bury the truth than confront it. Yet sometimes, against all odds, a secret clawed its way into the light. And when it did, the sheer horror of what it revealed shattered everything we thought we knew about family, about love, and about the price of silence. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Tonight, we dig into the forbidden history of one of the darkest unions ever recorded in America. A child bride, no more than 12, married off not to a stranger, not to a cousin, but to the man who had raised her, the man who shared her blood. Her own father. This is not fiction. This is not some Gothic tale from Europe's distant aristocracy. This happened here, in rural America, and it was accepted by an entire community that chose blindness over outrage. What makes this story all the more disturbing is how ordinary it looked on the surface, how neighbors smiled politely at the wedding, how the preacher muttered a blessing with trembling lips, and how photographs captured not horror, but a portrait of a family refusing to see the truth. For decades, the details remained hidden, passed down in fragments of hushed conversation and buried in courthouse files that no one dared open. But piecing them together, we find something much darker than a single act of abuse. We uncover a system of generational inbreeding, justified by warped religious conviction and defended by a culture that feared shame more than sin. And as we peel back the layers, you'll see how a young girl's stolen innocence became a symbol of everything her family wanted to protect and everything America wanted to forget. The story begins in the foothills of Appalachia, a place where the mountains themselves seem to guard secrets. Families here had lived in isolation for generations, bound by poverty, superstition, and an unspoken code that bloodlines must remain pure. Outsiders rarely visited, and when they did, they were met with guarded stares and half-truths. In this isolation, customs formed that the rest of America would consider unthinkable. The girl at the center of this story, her name rarely spoken aloud in local records, was born into one of these families. Her mother was already her father's cousin, and by the time the girl was old enough to speak, her future had been decided for her. She was not to belong to another man. She was to remain within the fold. Her body, her life, her very existence was a tool for preserving a bloodline that was already rotting from within. By the time she turned 12, whispers began circulating that her father had chosen her, in a place where child marriages were not uncommon, and where the word of a patriarch carried the weight of law. Few dared to object. Those who did fell silent quickly, their voices drowned by a community that prized loyalty to kin over protection of the innocent. The wedding itself was a quiet, almost ritualistic affair. Witnesses described it years later as strange but holy. The girl wore a dress sewn from scraps of her mother's old garments, a makeshift veil pulled low to hide her trembling face. Her father, decades older, stood with a confidence that seemed to mock the very idea of morality. The preacher, an aging man who had performed too many ceremonies just like this, read from the Bible without meeting her eyes. Some claimed his voice shook, others insisted he never flinched, but in either case the words were spoken, the union was sealed. Neighbors recalled seeing them afterward walking hand in hand through the dirt road that cut across their land. Some swore they looked like father and daughter, others said the sight was enough to make their stomachs turn, but no one intervened. Silence was safer. Silence was tradition. What makes this union even more disturbing is how it was recorded, neatly, legally, and without hesitation, in the county's marriage log. There it remains, a simple line of ink binding a girl to her father, proof that the impossible did in fact happen. What happened after the marriage was even more chilling than the ceremony itself. In the eyes of the law, she was a wife now. In the eyes of the community, she was both daughter and spouse, trapped in a role no child could ever understand. For her father, this was triumph, proof that he could bend not only his household, but the entire town to his will. Neighbors would later whisper that she stopped playing with the other children. The girl who once ran barefoot through the fields was suddenly confined to the cabin, seen only when walking behind him, her head lowered. If she spoke, it was in short, trembling sentences, never more than what was necessary. And when her body began to change, when her belly began to swell, the whispers turned into silence. People looked away. Some told themselves it was not their business. Others feared that acknowledging the truth would stain them too. The birth of her child was regarded not as tragedy, but as inevitability. The baby, frail, with unsettling features, was hidden from view, spoken of only in careful tones. Those who saw it claimed its eyes were set too close together, its jaw uneven, its tiny body fragile as glass. The family called it a blessing, the continuation of their line. But the midwife who delivered it left town soon after and never spoke of what she had witnessed again. It is here that the story moves beyond the girl and her father, because what we uncover is not simply the act of a man breaking every natural boundary, but the complicity of a society that allowed it, the courthouse that stamped their marriage certificate, the preacher who uttered the vows, the neighbors who looked away. Each one played a part in the creation of something too grotesque to put into words. When we examine history, we like to imagine that such things were isolated, that they were rare, that only the most depraved corners of humanity would allow them, but in reality these stories are woven into the fabric of America's forgotten towns, and while this child bride's story may stand out for its sheer horror, it is not alone. There were others, many others. Her father believed he had secured his family's bloodline. In truth, he had condemned it to a cycle of suffering that would ripple through generations, and the cost of that silence, of protecting a name instead of a child, would be felt long after both of them were gone. Generations later, locals still remember the family, though few are willing to speak openly. The cabin where they lived has long since collapsed into a skeleton of wood and rusting nails, swallowed by weeds and silence. Yet if you ask the oldest residents of the valley, they will tell you, always in hushed tones, that something was wrong with that bloodline. Children born too small, faces that seemed unfinished, as if God himself had turned away mid-creation. A pattern of sickness, weakness, and early death that no doctor could explain. The father himself grew older, but never repented. To him, the marriage was not a crime, but a fulfillment of his authority. He quoted scripture to justify what he had done, twisting ancient verses into weapons to silence any dissent. He told the girl, now his wife, now the mother of his children, that she had been chosen, that her suffering was holy. And in her silence, she carried not only her own shame, but the weight of a family that dared not speak against him. Some records hint that she attempted escape once. A cousin recalled finding her walking barefoot on the mountain road, clutching her infant to her chest, her face streaked with tears. She was brought back within hours. After that, she was rarely seen alone again. The message was clear. She was not allowed to leave. She was both prisoner and possession. By the time she turned 20, her body was worn from repeated pregnancies. Each child carried the unmistakable mark of inbreeding, subtle at times, grotesquely obvious at others, and yet the family celebrated each birth as though it were proof of divine favor. The girl's voice, once soft and hesitant, disappeared almost entirely. Those who knew her said she seemed to fade into the background of her own life, her identity erased until she was nothing but an extension of the man who claimed her. It is difficult to comprehend how an entire community could stand by, but perhaps that is the most chilling part of this story, the quiet agreement to protect the abuser, to shield the family name, to pretend that what was unfolding before their eyes was not happening. That silence was not ignorance, it was complicity, and it allowed a father's crime to become a legacy. Generations later, locals still remember the family, though few are willing to speak openly. The cabin where they lived has long since collapsed into a skeleton of wood and rusting nails, swallowed by weeds and silence. Yet if you ask the oldest residents of the valley, they will tell you, always in hushed tones, that something was wrong with that bloodline. Children born too small, faces that seemed unfinished, as if God himself had turned away mid-creation. A pattern of sickness, weakness, and early death that no doctor could explain. The father himself grew older, but never repented. To him, the marriage was not a crime, but a fulfillment of his authority. He quoted scripture to justify what he had done, twisting ancient verses into weapons to silence any dissent. He told the girl, now his wife, now the mother of his children, that she had been chosen, that her suffering was holy. And in her silence, she carried not only her own shame, but the weight of a family that dared not speak against him. Some records hint that she attempted escape once. A cousin recalled finding her walking barefoot on the mountain road, clutching her infant to her chest, her face streaked with tears. She was brought back within hours. After that, she was rarely seen alone again. The message was clear. She was not allowed to leave. She was both prisoner and possession. By the time she turned 20, her body was worn from repeated pregnancies. Each child carried the unmistakable mark of inbreeding, subtle at times, grotesquely obvious at others, and yet the family celebrated each birth as though it were proof of divine favor. The girl's voice, once soft and hesitant, disappeared almost entirely. Those who knew her said she seemed to fade into the background of her own life, her identity erased until she was nothing but an extension of the man who claimed her. It is difficult to comprehend how, though an entire community could stand by, but perhaps that is the most chilling part of this story, the quiet agreement to protect the abuser, to shield the family name, to pretend that what was unfolding before their eyes was not happening. That silence was not ignorance, it was complicity, and it allowed a father's crime to become a legacy. By the mid-20th century, the family's secret was no longer a secret at all. It had become a curse everyone recognized, but no one dared to name. School records from the county show clusters of children all bearing the same last name, children who looked more like siblings than cousins. Their teachers noted the same patterns: difficulty speaking, unusual appearances, an eerie quietness that set them apart from the others. Behind closed doors, the town whispered that they were the living proof of what happens when bloodlines fold back on themselves. But even as the evidence mounted, the cycle did not break. Instead, it deepened. The original child bride, now a mother many times over, had become a ghost within her own household. Photographs from the era show her standing in the background, eyes hollow, shoulders slumped, as though her very spirit had been erased. Her father-turned-husband aged beside her, proud and unrepentant, a patriarch who believed he had created a dynasty. To him, every child was proof of his power. To her, they were reminders of the prison she had never escaped. The tragedy of her children was not simply physical, it was psychological. Raised in isolation, they were taught that their reality was normal, that their suffering was God's will, that outsiders who looked at them with horror were wicked and corrupt. Some believed it. Others, as they grew older, felt only confusion and rage, torn between loyalty to their family and the undeniable sense that something was terribly wrong. And yet, despite everything, the family endured. Poverty kept them tied to the land. Fear kept them tied to each other. And silence, the silence of neighbors, of preachers, of lawmakers, allowed them to exist in plain sight. What happened inside their cabin was their business, the town decided. To interfere was to bring shame on everyone. But shame has a way of seeping into the soil. It lingers, unspoken but heavy, until generations later, descendants find themselves haunted by questions they cannot escape. Why do the old family photographs look so wrong? Why do the stories told at reunions trail off into uneasy laughter? Why does no one want to talk about where they came from? Because beneath every answer lies the truth. A child bride, married to her father, and a community that chose to protect the abuser rather than the innocent. Today, the valley where this family lived seems peaceful. The cabin is gone, swallowed by weeds and silence. The dirt road rarely traveled anymore. But the shadows remain. Speak to the elders and you'll hear the same nervous laugh, the same clipped reply. We don't talk about that. Some deny it ever happened, others admit only that things were different back then. Yet buried in courthouse files and whispered through generations, the truth refuses to die. The girl at the center of it all, the child bride who was forced to marry her own father, faded into anonymity. Her name was scrubbed from family records, her existence reduced to a few blurred photographs and scattered mentions in legal documents. She never escaped, never told her story in her own words. Her silence was both survival and surrender. And yet, in that silence, her suffering became eternal, etched into the history of her bloodline and the memory of her community. The father, meanwhile, died an old man, never punished, never exposed. To the outside world, he was nothing more than another farmer, another husband, another patriarch in a long line of men who ruled their households with iron authority. But to those who knew the truth, he was something much darker, a man who had twisted faith and family into a prison no child could escape. And so the story passed down, not as confession, but as warning. A reminder of what happens when silence becomes complicity, when entire communities turn away from evil because acknowledging it feels too heavy to bear. In this case, the silence was so complete that it preserved the crime for decades, until fragments surfaced, photographs, records, whispered memories, just enough for us to piece it back together. This is the power of hidden history. It doesn't stay buried forever. Sooner or later, someone stumbles across the clues, and the past demands to be seen. What you've just heard is not simply the story of one family. It's the story of how entire towns, entire generations, can become complicit in protecting darkness, and it forces us to ask, what secrets still lie buried in the places we call home? What stories do our grandparents refuse to tell? What truths are we still not ready to face? Because history is not just in books, it's in blood. And sometimes when you look too closely, you find things you were never meant to see.